So I'd like to welcome you all this evening to our discussion of healthy brain aging, something that in the last few months we've heard a lot about cognitive decline, and so we're trying to prevent that and keep us from experiencing dementia, Alzheimer's, and other ailments. So tonight we're going to have a nice discussion. It's going to be moderated by my colleague here, Susan Duncan. She has a PhD. She was a graduate of Queens College back in the day, went off and got her PhD, and then started her independent career, but she's come back now to the Graduate Center and is part of our speech, language, hearing sciences program. Her work focuses on improving the lives of stroke patients impacted by chronic aphasia. Okay. Next to her, we have the distinguished Desiree Byrd, PhD, a board-certified neuropsychologist and associate professor at Queens College and here at the Graduate Center. Her research explores the health inequities and the expression in the expression of cognitive dysfunction. A recent article of hers addressed the national controversy over race-based normative processes in neuropsychology and calls out the need really to focus on the underlying racist structures and practices that require these mitigations. Then we have Professor Nancy Foldi, Professor Emerita in Psychology and Neuroscience in the CUNY Graduate Center and at Queens College, and an adjunct professor of radiology at Weill Cornell Medical Center, Her research focuses on how the brain manages to rapidly allocate incoming information. We know we're all bombarded these days with information. So she can tell us how our brain manages to rapidly allocate things, store it. This is, of course, relevant to learning and to daily living activity, with a special emphasis of patients with Alzheimer's disease. And then in the far end here, we have Jennifer Manley, PhD, a professor of neuropsychology at the Gertrude H. Sergievsky Center and the Taub Institute for Research in Aging and Alzheimer's Disease at Columbia University. Her research aims to improve diagnostic accuracy of neuropsychological tests as it investigates the structures and social forces that relate to cognition and healthy brain function, with a specific focus on Black and Latinx cognition, or cognition in those communities in New York City. She's received numerous accolades for her mentoring of early career scientists from marginalized backgrounds and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. With that, I will turn it over to Susan. And thank you all, and thank everyone online.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for what seems to be, promises to be an extremely enlightening discussion on a topic that impacts all of us, or will soon enough, brain health and aging. So dementia, most commonly but not exclusively Alzheimer's disease, touches millions of lives across the globe. And as many of you may know firsthand, these effects are felt deeply by families, friends, and communities. And the amount of information available about these conditions can be pretty overwhelming. Sometimes it's hard to know what's science-based and what's speculative. So tonight we'll be breaking down facts. We will be exploring the ways you can protect and sustain brain health. And we'll be understanding what science tells us about risk, prevention, and also quality of life for those diagnosed. So we're going to just start with a brief look at the numbers to put the importance of this discussion into perspective. And as I know well from working with graduate students, everyone loves statistics. So right now, over 55 million people worldwide are living with dementia, and this number is projected to double, nearly double every 20 years, with cases expected to reach 139 million by 2050 if we don't make some significant breakthroughs in prevention and treatment. And in the US alone, Alzheimer's disease affects nearly 7 million people, and it's the 5th leading cause of death among older adults, accounting for actually 1 of 3 seniors who die of dementia-related conditions. Beyond the personal and emotional toll of dementia, there's a financial burden on our families and on our communities, and that's substantial. In 2024, the total cost of care for dementia patients in the US alone is projected to reach $360 billion. And these costs will only rise as the population continues to age. So this makes the need for effective prevention, early diagnosis, and management strategies more urgent than ever. Dementia and brain health are significant public health issues. And so in addition to this greater financial burden of dementia, it's very important to note the non-financial toll of dementia, which reaches far beyond the individuals diagnosed, profoundly affecting families, friends, and especially caregivers. As dementia progresses, patients often experience confusion, memory loss, and personality changes, which can be distressing for them and emotionally challenging for those who love and care for them. The daily demands on caregivers can be very intense, involving everything from managing medications and coordinating care in early stages to supporting very basic life activities like eating and dressing in later stages. Many caregivers are most often family members, and they experience heightened levels of stress, anxiety, and even depression, with recent estimates estimating that more than 40% of dementia caregivers report significant emotional strain. The average caregiver for an individual with dementia spends about 26 hours a week, often providing unpaid care, and that number rises as the disease progresses, ultimately impacting the caregiver's own health and well-being along with their families. And so these emotional and physical burdens really underscore the urgent need for resources and support, as well as effective strategies. But tonight, we're here not only to talk about the prevalence of dementia and its toll, with which we're all quite familiar, even if we don't know the exact statistics. We're also here to discuss, and we're mostly here to discuss, what we can do about it. You'll hear from our distinguished panel of experts about lifestyle habits and interventions that younger generations can adopt to reduce their risk of dementia, as well as insights on how to recognize when cognitive changes are part of normal aging versus when they may signal something more serious. And very importantly, current research shows that while genetics do play a role, lifestyle factors can have a significant impact on cognitive health. So studies actually suggest that up to 40% of dementia cases, and so nearly half, may be preventable through lifestyle modifications that include staying physically active, maintaining social engagement, adopting a nutritious diet, and managing cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension and diabetes. So these findings offer real hope, right? That we can influence our cognitive trajectories and quality of life as we age, no matter what age we are. So we'll be talking also about these nature versus nurture aspects of brain health. And so you've already heard from Dr. Gibney a bit of an introduction to our three esteemed panelists. They're each a leader in their field, and we look forward to exploring these topics in depth with them. So without further ado, I will ask each of the panelists in turn to tell us a bit more about yourself, about your work, and about how you ended up in this field. So I'll start with Dr. Byrd.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight too. And I have to acknowledge the honor it feels to be on a panel full of women and full of women who've mentored me. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. But I've come to this field, that was the question, right? I got a little distracted by being on such an esteemed panel. Through opportunities in college and after having access to working with various populations, it was working with older people that struck the strongest chord for me, that resonated and was the most meaningful. So that's how I arrived in aging and neuropsychology.
And Dr. Foldi.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you for having me and all these other people who were watching for this. I actually got interested in the brain, or one of my earlier careers had already been in college, because as frequently one has in academia, you have one teacher who helps and helps you get interested in it. And actually, my colleague here in linguistics, it was to really understand how language develops and how language changes, and particularly when brain is damaged, that you have aphasia, that you have it. And one of my lucky moments was to be able to participate in one of the first NIH-funded organizations in Boston, which was the Aphasia Research Center. And there was all the beginning of people who grew out of that to this day, started to look at brain and brain function in the VA system, and we had people coming with aphasia from all over the country because it was a VA system. And so that led me to continue in that vein, and again got another wonderful situation where I got to be the first neuropsychologist at Mount Sinai Medical Center, starting a Department of Geriatrics, which was unheard of at the time. Nobody knew how to spell it, actually. And as we know, that's rather important. So what went from aphasia, then went on to obviously looking in geriatrics of all the domains of cognition, language and memory and visual spatial function and everything that obviously all change. And from there then went on to be able to come to CUNY and start teaching and running a clinic and running that. So that's how I managed to where I am now.
Thank you. And Dr. Manley.
I'm also honored to be here. Thank you for having me. I went to college to become a physician, and I had to take electives other than my biology and organic chemistry classes, and I decided to take psychology. And I got the book on Friday, and by the time Monday rolled around, I had read the entire book. It was like, this is for me. This is incredible. I took a class there called Brain and Behavior, and some of the cases that Nancy described, these cases of aphasia, of brain injury that changed the way people behaved, were the most fascinating for me. And so one of my teachers in college suggested that I apply to go to graduate school and study neuropsychology, which I didn't know what it was. And I showed up. I actually got an interview in this graduate school program in San Diego without really knowing what neuropsychology was. So I found out during my interviews for graduate school. It turned out I went to a pretty good program. So good that the person who helped me with my dissertation data was Dr. Desiree Byrd, because she also got into the program. And our experience there, my experience there, was learning about neuropsychology, and the data that were there about brain and behavior were really very limited to mostly well-educated white English-speaking people. And it was a problem for the disease that I was researching at the time, HIV, because the face of HIV infection was so different. And we didn't know anything about how these neuropsychological tests, how these measures would work in these other populations. And in graduate school, it's a little frustrating because we didn't have much data on these populations. So when I looked for a postdoctoral fellowship, I did a lit search. It wasn't even PubMed then. It was like Ovid. I forget what it was called. It was a long time ago. But I just looked neuropsychological and African American. And up popped a huge study in New York City where they had recruited older adults in Washington Heights, thousands of them, to study their brain and behavior over time. And I looked at the faculty, and I found someone whose name I recognized, and I emailed her and said, I'd like to come and do a postdoc there. And so, as it turned out, I did do a postdoc at Columbia, and I've never left since. I became faculty. And my postdoc, one of my postdocs was Desiree Byrd. So it's been a while. I've participated in these community-based studies of aging and dementia, which really have changed the face of what we know about cognitive aging, because they're diversifying the set of information that we have.
Yeah, great. Thank you all so much for that. And just to follow up, because this is a conversation that we have a lot in language sciences, where we have an overwhelming bias towards using English. And in that case, like, not only does everyone have the right to be represented, right, but also the fact that if we're just studying English, we're not actually learning about language, right? Like, and if we're, in the case, my interest, aphasia, if we're just understanding how, aphasia manifests in English, then we're not actually understanding aphasia. So it's, in addition to there being like an ethical kind of imperative, there's also a scientific aspect that, is of the utmost importance. Thank you. So I'd like to start just with a sort of general brain health question, and I've sort of alluded to this in the introduction, but just what would you each say are the most important lifestyle factors that contribute to healthy brain aging, and how do aspects of general health like sleep, diet, exercise contribute to brain health? So, whoever's eager.
And that's part of my test for everybody. Well, I think that, again, looking lifespan, actually, I want to bring that up right away, because I think that how the brain develops is so fascinating to understand why things like sleep or things like exercise all participate in brain development. And in particular, for instance, as another linguist over here, certainly how the brain develops and how incredible it is that you have a baby who emerges and then cries, and how that can actually, everybody's always, that's an exciting moment. And as the early development of brain, which we still know very little about, by the way, in fact, how that functions, is the development of language and the development of vision and the development of remembering, and oh, that's mommy and that's not mommy. Like, how does the brain do that? And then, of course, there's the issue that comes up when cognition develops, is that sort of incredible moment of the first word. That is, how does that brain develop to be able to do that just by hearing all this around, and suddenly it's mommy, or suddenly it's boat, or it's, I don't think they say computer as the first word, but some of them might now, actually. But that to me is pretty amazing, that a brain can do that. And so when we do think about how brain develops, now I'm going to, over the lifespan, and all these steps that it goes through to do that it actually integrates so many different phenomena, which is memory, which is language, which is how visual spatial, how you see things and organize it, how you take lots of things all together and decide how to do that. And I think what has happened incredibly in the work of my two colleagues here too also, is that those types of individual cognitive areas, the fact that one part can be impaired and other parts can't be impaired. So somebody's spatial is very good, but their language is not. And we know that the memory is good, but the language isn't. And the development of the brain and the interconnectivity of the brain is also what is now happening, what we've helped learn in Alzheimer's disease, is precisely that some areas can be impaired, but some not. But as the disease develops, it starts integrating all of the other cognitive domains. And so some of my work has been also that connectivity, or how do certain areas of brain in Alzheimer's disease, why are they so vulnerable and some of them not? And basically, that is the development of the disease and how much those measures are affected by sleep or affected by different, exercises or being able to do it. And so that's been, to me, very, very interesting to investigate.
So you asked about lifestyle factors. I really, really, really don't like that term, lifestyle factors, because it implies that somehow there's like a lifestyle that is good for your brain necessarily. Because I've looked at data about modifiable risk factors for brain, aging, what I find is that some of the most powerful factors that drive brain health are not about our own personal lifestyle. It's about the society that we live in and the policies and the opportunities that people have. In fact, one of the strongest, probably the strongest modifiable risk factor of all of those that you mentioned, of the 42% that go through the life course, is education. Education, early life education. The more education people have, the more educational opportunities people have, the better their brain health. And it operates in really interesting ways, many different pathways, one of which is really important, is called cognitive reserve. So all of us are our brain is going to change, our brain is going to age, we're going to have vascular changes in our brain. Most people die with amyloid and tau in their brain, but not everyone has dementia. In fact, there's this disconnect, which you can call it reserve, this disconnect between the level of neuropathology in the brain of the amyloid and tau, which are the abnormal proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease, and the level of cognitive function. And what explains that gap are these reserve factors, like years of education, like socioeconomic status, like activities, cognitive engagement. So that is what I think is most exciting, is that even though many of us will experience this pathology in our brain, the more reserve we have, the less likely it will show cognitive decline. And the other point I want to make about education is that it changes the level of cognitive, reserve and compensation, and the level of cognition that you have entering into old age. When you look at older adults over time, we're all kind of declining at the same pace. It's a little depressing, but we're all declining more or less at the same pace. If you start out with a higher level of memory, then you have longer until you meet that sort of threshold in which memory becomes a problem. And the thing that operates on that intercept the best are these early life factors. And so I hope we get a chance to talk more about that. It also seems to explain why there's a lot of disparities in brain health. And so that's my favorite lifestyle factor, is education.
Well, I think then we can, thank you for that response. I think we can also leap ahead to talking about social determinants of health, because, yeah, we know that the best predictor of your, health in your medical care is your zip code, right? Which is not the way that it should be. And so there are, so many social determinants of health, like education, access to health care, socioeconomic status, and they do significantly impact brain health outcomes. And, they create and or exacerbate inequalities. So are there unique brain health challenges that, and this is, I guess, more at a systemic level than at a personal level, that are faced by underserved communities? And if there are gaps in care and research, what can we do, I guess, as the public and or as the research community to kind of, close these disparities? And obviously, so when does brain health start? Probably at conception, right? Like if you think about maternal health and, nutrition and things like that, and, in utero, that makes a big difference. And certainly, considering educational opportunities in really early childhood. But so.
Well, I do want to mention that, the pathway through all of these social determinants is very complex. And what we do know is that people who have better heart health tend to have better brain health. So when we talk about, some of these risk factors that, we can perhaps modify, maybe one of the greatest sort of pathways is through vascular health. And so what this means is that, social determinants like, do you have a safe place to go out and walk and exercise? Social determinants like, stress. I mentioned education. We talked about poverty earlier. These are the types of social determinants that have a lot of impact on not just brain health, but also vascular health. People are more likely to have stroke, more likely to have hypertension and diabetes if they have those kind of exposures throughout their life.
Indeed, and when you bring up social determinants of health, I think about access, and you did mention access. I think about the location of neurology clinics, memory disorder clinics, where neuropsychologists, we're part of a very elite group when we think about the provision of health services, and so brain health services. So there's so much that goes into that. We could design an entire year-long course to traverse through these, but I think about access to care as well. That becomes more important at the point of poor brain health, more so than, because we don't have a public health system that is preventative and educational, right? It's responsive, because if we did, then we would all know about brain health. We wouldn't have to wait to become full adults to even hear about brain health. We would grow up with a sense of brain health and know that our gut, there's a gut-brain axis, to know that the vasculature of the brain, how important it is that there plenty of blood flow, gets to our brain to feed it, to do all the work that we require it to do. And then we need to rest it, because the brain does its own work when our eyes and our mind are quiet. So there's a lot in that question, but thank you.
Great. Thank you. So how much do these factors like nature versus nurture then influence brain health? We've heard a bit of this, but there may be, I appreciate that there are so many people who are so interested in being here tonight, and even we're here lined up early, which is wonderful, and maybe you're on Zoom early too, but I didn't see you. But so some people may be here and particularly enthusiastic about the topic because they may have a genetic predisposition, because they have, family history of dementia, et cetera. And so, I think we've already heard some of the things that people can do to kind of take control over their brain aging, and we know that there is a large percent that is not genetically determined, but what kind of control do people have functionally over their brain aging then?
So I'll just point out a few favorite sort of recent studies that came out. One of them was about hearing aids. So it randomized people to getting a hearing aid. And this is not just any hearing aid, it's a well-fitted hearing aid, which is actually not trivial. If you do have a hearing aid, if it's not well-fitted, it is very annoying and not helpful. And so what these people got was, sort of an ongoing, appointment with an ENT to fit their hearing aid, and a high quality hearing aid. And as it turned out, after in this clinical trial, it was a randomized clinical trial, the people who were randomized to getting the hearing aid had better cognition at the end of the trial. Not only that, but they were thrilled with their hearing aid. They were happy. They were happier, they were more engaged, more socially engaged, less depressed. And so all of these, were huge benefits to having a hearing aid. Many of them, most of them did not have hearing impairment, right? So this is just randomized to normal community-dwelling older adults without hearing impairment. So the hearing aid study was really cool to me. Another one, our lab examined the paper just the other day, randomized diabetics to getting essentially Ozempic or Wegovy or not, or other treatments for diabetes. And the people who were randomized to the Ozempic drug were less likely to have a electronic medical record diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease than people who were diabetic and who got randomized to the other treatments. And so again, this is a high-risk population. People with diabetes are more likely to get dementia later in life. But with this particular treatment, it showed quite a huge effect on their later life cognition. And then the other trial I think I'll mention that I think is important is the Sprint Mind trial that randomized people to getting who are hypertensive to getting aggressive treatment to lower their blood pressure to 120/80 as opposed to, I guess it's 140/whatever. The systolic blood pressure of normal target for treatment is 140, but this one is more aggressive, getting people down to 120. And they were less likely to develop mild cognitive impairment if they were randomized to this more aggressive hypertension treatment than if they were not. So these are some really, I think, exciting moves forward. One other thing I'll mention, I do a lot of international work, and one of them is, one of the studies is in South Africa, where they have these cash transfers to prevent diseases and conditions like HIV infection. They randomize households to getting more money every month to prevent, if they had a teenage girl in the household, to prevent HIV transmission. The teenage girls who were in the higher income, or the higher, were randomized to getting more money every month, higher cash transfer, were less likely to get HIV. But if there was an older adult in the household of those, where those teenage girls lived, and they have large households, with multi-generational households, the older adults were less likely to have cognitive decline if they were among the households randomized to that higher level of income. So there's so many things that we can do, I think, both structurally, socially, and sort of healthcare-wise, to better these prospects.
I guess one of the comments with that, which is wonderful research that you've been doing, it also speaks to us making sure that we're just not looking up at the brain by itself, and that we're looking at full body, so that we're looking at cardiac function, we're looking at gastrointestinal function, we're looking, all of that has a huge, and obviously social things as well, has an enormous effect on brain function. And so everybody thinking Alzheimer's disease is just something of the brain, I think we really have to, I mean, we've done this, but I want to emphasize it even more, that just how important all of health is important, and just not, and that, goes back to issues that we need to be doing with insurance companies. Well, this isn't included, but this is included, and therefore, you can't do it, or I don't know what. I mean, we've all gone through trying to talk to insurance companies. But that aspect of understanding that is the full body has everything to do with the brain, and keeping that body healthy in every possible way makes a huge difference on the brain. And so I think that just emphasizes it.
Indeed, and that's especially true for people who have a known genetic risk. Many of us have plenty of unknown genetic risks, but for those of us with known genetic risks, caring for our whole bodies and not being consumed with the knowledge of that risk, even if we appreciate that it's not a one-to-one, because it isn't, thank goodness, having a genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease does not mean that we will develop Alzheimer's disease. And so when you ask about, if we know we have a genetic risk, what are some things that we can do? All the things that we're talking about, maybe amplified and not being focused on that genetic risk. So those are some ways I think we can strike that balance between nature and nurture when it comes to dementia.
Thank you. So basically, we should all be doing the same kinds of things to support our brain health. We're independent of whether we have a known or the degree to which, because we all have a risk, right? Because we all have brains. But yeah. So I think, so MCI, or mild cognitive impairment, was mentioned, and that's a clinical diagnosis that sometimes precedes Alzheimer's disease, develops into Alzheimer's disease, or sometimes it, just stays in this, kind of mild impairment zone for a while. And Dr. Manley had mentioned how, well, we're all going to decline, but, and at a similar rate, but, there is obviously a certain amount of forgetfulness, slower processing speed, word retrieval issues that occur with healthy aging. And so probably a question that people are interested in, and just as an aside, we will have some time for questions. I know there's a lot of exciting things being set up here, and you might all have questions. We will have time. But my question here now is, how do we differentiate between things that, the kinds of changes that are happening with healthy aging, and then things that may be, more significant, or, when we would want to seek out a neuropsychologist, for example, for testing, or speak to our, medical doctors, et cetera?
Yeah, I think the point at which the problems interfere with our abilities to do the things that we either need to do or want to do, that point may be different for different people because we're not all starting at the same level. Some of us are hypersensitive to the normal changes. And so one of the best things that people can do, I think, is bring it up to a healthcare professional and get their opinion and receive an evaluation if that's available for you. But if it's the type of forgetfulness that eventually comes back around, and then you do locate the keys, but you're not missing the payment of bills, you're not getting lost on your way to the bodega that, or your favorite bagel shop. Those functional pieces that interfere, again, with your hobbies or your ability to take care of yourself, that's one of the best indicators of that difference.
And I think another piece of it is that how much you know yourself and how much other people can see. I think that's another component. A lot of times, yes, you do know that I can't follow, get to where I wanted to go, but then I get there eventually, and of course, I do remember it. But a lot of the problems that happens with dementias, of course, is that you don't know what's happening, and it's others who are seeing it. And that, of course, all families have dealt with, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, but my son says I'm not. And I think that piece is very difficult. And I also turn to physicians who do see patients regularly and internists, that sometimes the issue of behavior and the issue of awkwardness is not brought up, in those quick 15 minutes that you get to see your physician. And I think that's another area of help that we can do. And I've worked with geriatricians for many years, who are physicians who are obviously interested in the, sort of that part of lifespan and at the end of life, or throughout that whole period. But even then, that still keeps coming up, which is not being able to talk about an event, and I don't want my son to hear me, and what you know and what the son knows is very different. So that's something to work towards, I think, in the general internist and general geriatric world that is not always dealt with. And I think it's very and the reason is it's because it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult to, take the doctor aside, or, the son knows that something's happening but doesn't know what to do with it. How do we tell mom, not to do that? Or if you tell it to her, she forgets it. But, am I supposed to go to her doctor now? And so I think that's an area that we all need to improve, basically, in the medical field to help facilitate that.
The number one risk factor for dementia and cognitive decline and mild cognitive impairment is getting older. It's age. It's a stronger risk factor than any genetic risk factor you can, the one that is most commonly talked about, the ApoE4 allele. 1 year of age is much stronger than that risk factor in most people. So, I think, and another point is that the demographics of the United States and of the world is completely changing. The baby boomers are now older adults, and that sort of the shape of the demography of the United States is going to change, and that worries a lot of people. That's the Alzheimer's Association's main kind of thrust. We are about to experience a huge number of people who are older and therefore at higher risk. What that makes me think of is that maybe some of the stigma that you were talking about, Nancy, will that reduce? You know, there's a lot of talk about dementia-friendly communities, you know, where cognitive impairment is essentially a part of getting older for, you know, in a lot of populations. Are we going to be able to shape our communities so that they're more accommodating to, you know, different cognitive functions? The other piece, though, is that I think that everyone in this room and everyone listening should feel very empowered when they go in and they get their, not 15, but 7 minutes with their physician to say, hey, are you going to assess my cognitive function? Because that's part of my annual wellness exam. And I expect you to, you know, do a cognitive assessment. What does that look like? I think everyone should feel, you know, completely empowered to talk about that, whether they're having cognitive, you know, complaints or not.
That's a great point, and in line with the preventative healthcare that, you know, we've said is not as present as it should be in our, you know, healthcare or sickness care kind of system. So, and just a thought, because we have regular screenings of like kids in school for language and, you know, little speech screeners and hearing screeners, and you know, maybe this is something that we should be, we don't really have those kinds of programs in the community for older adults, just sort of standardly across. Is anyone familiar?
Well, it was something that when I was at Mount Sinai in the geriatrics department, I insisted that every geriatrician who comes through had to know how to give a brief exam and know what they were looking for as well. I mean, that was my biggest role, and I like to think that there were a couple of generations of geriatricians who did okay and improved. But I think there's not a lot of places that have geriatrics. And I think the issue that internal medicine doesn't get it. And that's when we have to really have where we have to put our ideas in to really change that, is the internal medicine.
You know, it's really interesting that, you know, screening in early childhood is so important because early intervention is so important. You know, you can turn everything around if you get that child in that early stage. That has not been a motivation for Alzheimer's disease. I mean, my own father, if you're listening, he'll probably watch this. He's not listening right now. My own father was like, well, why should I get a screen? Why should I get an exam? You can't do anything about it anyway. And now, you know, there are, you know, these new treatments that are coming online. I'm very highly opinionated about them because they have a very small effect and they're very, very burdensome, very expensive treatments. But once there is a really effective treatment for people who, you know, have a cognitive decline, that's going to change everything. Because then, you know, there will be on the corner screening places. Just one thing to mention is that when, you know, the drug companies did try, and I think to some extent it's happening, to have a sort of, you know, corner drugstore-based cognitive screen. They thought that if they could get CVS to participate, you know, the pharmacists get to participate in these screens, then that would turn more people to potential users of these medications, from Biogen and Lilly and all of that. You know, I don't know, just looking at, you know, who is actually getting access to these medications, they're not widely used. And so, you know, there seems to be a disconnect between kind of what the drug companies want, which is a lot of people to have cognitive, you know, complaints and cognitive impairment, versus the actuality, which is there's really very few people that are getting access to this new generation of medications. But I think that the treatment will drive the screening.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. I mean, I think that some of the newer medications are really getting into the, upper class, wealthy people who are able to participate in getting it. And again, in a way that's participating in the issue of not being able to look at the entire population, which is very upsetting. If we're going to make this work, it has to work for everybody.
Yeah, I guess there might be a question of how much of that is related to, what third parties will pay for in terms of treatment also. And I know that just coming from a clinical background in speech language pathology, when I went to school for my clinical work, which was not that long ago, we didn't even deal with any kind of neurodegenerative, Parkinson's and speech motor kinds of things, but like in terms of like cognitive function and neurodegenerative, whether for memory or for language, it really wasn't something we touched. We didn't think that we could do anything about it, but there is more and more research that is demonstrating that we can, even with behavioral therapies, make differences, usually not gains, but, maintenance or for longer periods of time. And so I think that's potentially exciting and, still somewhat understudied. Although I think there's also a lot more funding being put towards research in aging now and neurodegeneration. So maybe we'll be getting more exciting, more of the treatment that drives the screening. Are there any other sorts? Neuroscience, human neuroscience, a real viable human neuroscience is a pretty young field still, and so there's still a lot that we're certainly learning about how the brain works and how we can work the brain. But there have been a lot of advances. So are there sort of more promising, whether therapies or treatments that are aimed at preventing or slowing cognitive decline, whether Alzheimer's disease at all? And again, given that not all communities share equal access, as we were just saying, what can we do to make sure that any innovations are available to the whole people? CUNY is very devoted to the whole people, so.
Well, so I want to respond to the latter part of your question, because the only thing that's going to drive the access piece that you mentioned is going to be social activism from the ground up. And so we would have to just generate enough public action to demand access. But before we do that, we'd have to make sure that it's worth the getting, right? So what the hype of a medication is different from what the medication actually does to a person, and what the management of, no medication is without side effects. We all hear the commercials where at the end they go, this medication may cause that. We need to slow down that part and take a real listen. And to gain a literacy to the point where we don't just believe what the commercial says, but come to functions like this and talk to our physicians and say, so what does that medication really do? Because statistically, on the paper, after all the calculations, it may show an improvement. But do you know anybody who's taken it, who's had a significant change in how their lives are? So there's a big difference between the hype and the reality, and I think the public would have to push for those kinds of demands. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that, this aspect of, looking at the pharmacology and how much money there is in it, and the question of, whether there's effectiveness also speaks to this kind of systems level issue where, a lot of these drugs are developed with research dollars and basically tax funding, and then turned over to companies who are able to charge. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's not a disease really that isn't, subject to some of the pharmaceutical company, actions. But one of the things about the recent set of drugs that are sort of these amyloid busters is that they're really good at removing all the amyloid from the brain. They actually completely wipe it out. So once you take it, the amyloid after several months is completely gone. The problem is that people keep having cognitive decline even after all the amyloid is gone. So, they're not disease modifying in the way that really we care about. In fact, there's a new problem, which is that if you are on one of these amyloid busting drugs and you have no more amyloid, then according to the new criteria, which are entirely biologically based, right, to get the drug, you no longer have Alzheimer's disease. So your amyloid is gone, you don't have Alzheimer's disease, but you're continuing to decline cognitively. And now that there's lecanemab and donanemab, right, those are two different drugs, they want, if you were on lecanemab and now your amyloid is gone, but you're continuing to decline, they want to put you on donanemab, but you don't have Alzheimer's disease anymore because all your amyloid is gone. So there's just a lot of confusing stuff going on in our field that, even about what we call the disease. There was an article that just came out about nomenclature, like are the terms that we're using actually getting across to the people, our patients and our families and our loved ones and our communities? So we need to do better. I think this is a very heightened time right now because we're looking to really, reduce the burden of cognitive decline. I mentioned some of the trials that I really like, some of the findings that I find super exciting, much more hopeful in a way to preserving cognitive function as people age earlier. So I would encourage people to focus on those because they are going to require policy change and investment in certain aspects of our life, including investment in schools. Schools that serve poor children that grow up in families that are experiencing poverty, and schools that serve children whose first language is not English, and so on. So those are some of the I think very exciting opportunities that we have to improve cognition overall.
But I just want to add your last two words, or to improve cognition, that is such an important measure that we have to be including all the time. And it can't just be the medication or the change of the decrease in amyloid being the only thing. I'm seeing that a lot now in the work that I'm doing, that, we have to also measure everything else that we know from the neuropsychological years that we've all been putting together, how incredibly important that is to be able to measure drug efficacy. It doesn't make the money, though, and I think there's an element of that. But it certainly is interesting now to see how people do respond to the cognitive and the behavioral elements that have to be measured at the same time.
And as Dr. Manley pointed out, the connection with amyloid, if people get rid of their amyloid and they still have issues, that's, maybe amyloid shouldn't be the target. And my understanding is that we probably all in this room have some amyloid in our brains, right? So that's certainly not the only consideration and not the priority in terms of function and
But I also
people's
think that
lives,
it's
certainly.
understandable why we got here, because it's been amyloid, and that's been the story for many years, so finally this is happening. But I would like to see it now emerge and to include other things as well.
Yeah, and we certainly want objective biomarkers to use, if they work, I guess, which is the point that's being made. So with that, I would love to open this up to questions from you folks in the audience. And okay, I see a hand, and I think we have a microphone coming around.
With respect to what Dr. Manley said about the removal of amyloid and nevertheless the continued decline, I've read about that, and I just wonder if there's research going on in it seems to me that may not be the answer. So I'm just wondering if there's research going on in other things that may, in fact, be the cause of Alzheimer's and other dementias as well.
Yes. So there's research going on vascular disease. So, we all, just like we all probably have amyloid in our brain, we all probably have some degree of vascular disease. So changes in the white matter of our brain that is related to sort of the capillaries that get stiff and also don't work as well as they should as we get older. That's part of the reason why I said this connection between heart health and brain health. So there are people looking to improve the vascular function of the brain through, all sorts. Exercise is one of them, but other interventions as well. I actually mentioned the Ozempic finding because one of the actions that it seems to work on very well is inflammation. So sort of inflammatory processes are now being increasingly targeted as a potential, trigger for some of these changes in the brain that cause cognitive decline. And that may be why this particular drug, in a group of people, diabetics who have higher inflammation, may be preventing or reducing the likelihood of cognitive decline.
I think I see, oh, sorry. Yes, please.
Two questions. From what I hear, would you say that the amount of stress that one endures throughout their lifestyle could be the driver of this dementia and Alzheimer's? And two, Dr. Manley, you mentioned reserves. What would be in those reserves?
Okay, what would be in those reserves? Okay. You want to take the stress?
I'll take the stress one. So lifetime stress, so when we are, our responses to stress do things in our body, right? It releases, it has a chemical reaction in our body. And the longer we are stressed, the longer those chemicals are around in our body that aren't supposed to be there on a continual basis. And so a stressed lifetime, it won't be the trigger for the onset necessarily. There's no single factor for dementia, right? We all keep talking about a number of things. Stress and inflammation, since inflammation follows stress, is a contributor. And if we've been stressed over a lifetime, then that's more of that contributing factor in our body, absolutely. So you really hit a good point there about a lifetime of stress. Now for the reserve piece.
So Nancy started out telling us sort of how the brain develops and how amazing it is. There are many connections that are made. And as it turns out, the more connections that your brain, the more connections that your brain has, the more likely you are to be able to compensate for damage to one of those areas or one of those connections. So that is one of the ideas behind sort of cognitive reserve, is that you sort of, you have like a full gas tank, and you can go down a little bit more, but you're still rolling, you're still running, your motor's still running. If your gas tank is almost empty, you really don't have that far to go until you run out of gas. So that's kind of the idea behind reserve, is like sort of, you've got a bunch of connections, this big beefy brain with all these connections, you can lose some. The other idea is compensation. So it may not be so much about having a more connections, but maybe having stronger connections. So use it or lose it kind of idea, that might be what reserve is. And if you strengthen these connections, then you are more likely to be able to compensate. And use another sort of strategy or another network, another neural network, another brain network to do the task once you lose a little bit as you age.
I see a hand over here.
Actually, my question is maybe following upon what you were just saying about brain reserve. You mentioned education as being a factor. And I guess two questions. Is it formal education, or is it education in the general sense that you keep learning? Because you mentioned, you use it or lose it, and I know a number of people do crossword puzzles, or they learn on their own, or they read books. So, yeah, if you could respond.
Well, I'll bring a little bit of research to it, which is that we had the opportunity in Washington Heights to study a group of people with no formal education at all, some of whom have literacy skills, they know how to read and write, and some of whom do not. And they have literacy skills because they learned how to read and write informally, in the family setting or the church setting, but not in school. Some of them are older kids who were the oldest in their families, and they essentially were not permitted to go to school because they had to work and take care of things, and things changed over time so that their younger siblings were able to go to school, were able to learn and read and write, and they came back to the house and taught their older siblings how to do it. And what we found was that, so these are all people with no formal schooling, some are literate and some are not. The people with literacy were less likely to develop dementia over time. And so that is a really, that's kind of my love. My interest is to try to dig into, well, when you say school and you say education, like, what do you really mean? Because it means so many different things depending on where you grew up, what you were exposed to, and what kind of investment we talked about earlier, what kind of investment there was in school. We all know a lot of people who really had very little formal school, but are aging very well. And so there is, it's not a one-to-one, but that to me is fascinating, sort of learning what are the things that engage and what are the mechanisms that engage people over time. It could be that schooling, sitting in that classroom, keeps you away from doing bad things like smoking and drinking and being a delinquent, and that could be what school does. It could be that it actually changes the development of the brain, so you're learning all the math and the algebra and the literature and the critique and all of these different ways of thinking, abstraction. Or it could be that when you go to school, you get a degree, and that actually is a credential that provides you with resources, like a credential that you can use. It can say, okay, I have my high school degree, now I can get a college, I have a college degree, now I can get a high-paying job. And it may not even be what happens in the seat, in the classroom, to the brain. So there's lots of different ways to think about it, and we're trying to break it down to understand it, because once we understand it, we know priorities for intervention.
Yes, very interesting. And one of the questions that I have has to do with your reserve issue. I have a friend who is cognitive of the fact that she is declining. And your suggestion was, or is, that there's drugs that may be available to prevent further decline. However, is there a similarity between people that have a stroke? If you have a stroke, you can go to physical therapy, and you can find ways to bring back some of the skills that you've lost from the stroke. Now, since she's so aware of the decline of her brain, are there pathways other than drugs that you can utilize in order to shore up, to reinforce those pieces of your brain that are still functional? And the second part of that is, I have looked repeatedly online for universities or government agencies that are doing research and looking for volunteers to participate in their studies that would accept this particular person, so that she could be both a victim, if you will, and a participant, rather than just sit quietly and let it happen. So how can you be proactive in this kind of environment?
Well, There were a lot of questions there. The one about essentially, are there non-pharmacologic interventions, right? Did I hear you right? The science doesn't support it strongly. So there is a field called cognitive remediation, and there are activities that appear to be more effective for people who have suffered from a traumatic brain injury rather than a degenerative disease like Alzheimer's disease. So I'm not personally aware of any science that has produced evidence that remediation can reverse or slow the cognitive components of dementia, right?
I agree with you.
Yeah, that's, and I'm embarrassed. I want to say I'm embarrassed to say that because I'm a behavioral scientist, but I have to be accurate. And so that part is true. And then with regards to clinical trials and studies, I hope you're looking at the academic medical centers. There are a lot of them here in New York. We're so fortunate to live. So not only can we come to events like these, there are 5 at least academic medical centers that have active trials. I'm not aware of how people can get to them so easily. One of you may know. Yeah.
They have online, sign-ups, registries. There's a lot of them. If you go to the Alzheimer's Association website, it's very like clicking down to sort of trial match. It's called Trial Match, and that's one resource that off the top of my head. I do want to say we have an early career researcher at NYU that's participating in one of our resource center for minority aging research at Columbia University, and she works in a older adult sort of nursing home setting, and she's working with music therapy. She's a music therapist, and I think that she finds that music therapy is very effective in people who are experiencing memory impairment. Now, how do we change that? How do we sort of make that available to people who are still living at home and who are still functioning in their own environment? That's a question that we hope by encouraging her early career, we can get sort of more ideas. But she's developing an app, essentially a music therapy app. One of the other scientists that I spoke to just comes to mind right now is interested in sort of assistive devices, in particular, like the Google Home or the Alexa devices that can passively monitor people when they're at home and help with reminders, help with sort of ordering supplies. Sometimes we go into the homes of older adults who are experiencing cognitive impairment, and there's not any supplies there. They've run out of all the things because they're forgetting to take care of things. So some of those automated kind of computer-based devices, there's a lot of innovation going on with that.
And I'll just comment also, so clinicaltrials.gov has, you can search online, and it includes, you can search by condition, and you can narrow that search regionally. And then, in relation to these kinds of assistive devices, there are, so there's cognitive therapy that's done by speech therapists, speech language pathologists also, and it might be focused on something like using external devices, but to help maintain function, and so that can help maintain quality of life. So I would encourage looking at those sorts of, even if it's not actually going to slow or change the progression of the disease, it can still have benefits. So I think actually with that, just to keep us on time, I just wanted to kind of ask a 2-part closing question, which is, and I'm sorry, maybe you can tell the Grad Center how much you've enjoyed this event, and we will have another one in the near future. But I wanted to, so it can be either or both, but is there one common myth about brain aging you'd like to debunk for our audience? And is there one lifestyle change or daily habit that you can change now, right, that you would recommend that we all change when we walk out of here this evening to have the greatest positive impact on our brain health?
Well, everyone's going to hear that exercise is important, and I certainly think that even though sometimes it's hard to go do it, or you don't really want to do it, it obviously has an enormous effect on vascular changes as well. And I think that's a theme that we're hearing over and over again, that it's not just the area of the brain, but in fact how that brain is working, and vascular functioning is incredibly important. And you know, the other part of exercise doing that, I think, is the social interactions. And that part of the problems that, you know, a lot of time people being very much alone in and of itself, I don't know if it's direct change with how it changes on the brain, but the activity of being with others is incredibly important. And I think that is something that you sort of get you get a lot of emphasis and a lot of help just with doing you know, one kind of thing because it's a group that's doing it or things like that. And I think that remains something that is something that can really continue on in life for a long time. And it's social. I think it's a social piece that really needs to be emphasized.
I think my one takeaway from the buffet of things that can help our brains stay healthy, and the one I'm sharing with you, I'm speaking to myself, and that's more sleep. I don't know about you all, but I do not get the amount of sleep that I know that my brain needs. There's a magic, there's a sweet spot in the cycles that our brains go through, and we have to sleep long enough for the brain to go through all of those cycles. So improved sleep would be my one pick from the buffet.
I love that. I would say, you know, the myth is that Alzheimer's disease and dementia is a you know, strictly medical problem. I love your introduction because you said it's a public health problem, and in that I think it's looking at sort of the prevention and the public health aspect of it. The whole you know, brain health story begins, you know, even before we're born. It begins with a healthy neighborhoods, healthy conditions, healthy societies where brain health is a priority. So that would be one myth. And then I was going to emphasize the social interaction. Over and over again, studies show that people who are more socially engaged have better brain aging. You know, there's all sorts of things that go along with that, but it's something that I think is attainable for everybody. It may be hard, it may be, you know, breaking out, doing something new, but, you know, family, friends, you know, groups, things like this, where you're in a social setting, those are the types of activities that are associated with better brain health, and so that would be my one pick.
So I think that means that everyone should make sure that they're on the mailing list for the Graduate Center for more social engagement. And then we should probably thank our panelists so much and go home and get some sleep.